I've got a little bit of something to say before I get on to the introduction, so don't panic.
All right.
Okay.
Right, so, hello everyone.
You haven't introduced us.
Oh, for That's sort of the cold opening.
Yeah.
Ooh.
An actual cold opening. That's the first thing we said, so yeah. On with the episode for real this time. Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 27 of the Co-Conspirators Podcast. On the date of recording, we can bring you some breaking news. It might not be so breaking when the time this actually gets out, because I'm quite slow with the old editing, but forgive me. We are very saddened, especially long-time fans of the podcast, we're very saddened to hearing the passing of Prince Philip, member of the British royal family, and also the Greek and Danish royal families, as I was informed. He was a very good man, served in the wars, had a long and healthy life, and also spawned one of the very first in-jokes for the Co-Conspirators podcast. So listen along to our fan-favourite game, Conspiracy, in our very first episode if you want to understand the reason why he holds such significance to us.
Yeah, I mean, he'll forever be in memory, and as a podcast, we're definitely indebted to him. There's no conspiracy about how great it is, and it's a true tragedy.
You know, we've referenced this joke so many times, so we never thought just a little offhanded theory would have been so, so infamous in co-conspirators law, but there you go. Thanks to John for pointing it out.
Of course, there's the island in the, I think, Pacific Ocean that worships Prince Philip, so that'll be in mourning.
A national week of mourning, at least, I hope.
I mean, national year.
Can't we have one of those? Yet another year off. But so let's try to get back to the episode. So whether you're a regular co-conspirator or tuning in for the first time, we're glad to have you on board and I hope you find this to be an entertaining listen. You can find us on all major podcasting platforms, as well as on YouTube by searching for the Co-Conspirators Podcast. We've had listeners in over 50 different countries and have reached 37 out of 50 US states.
Pretty sure we're in like 42 states now.
42 now? Blimey, it's gone up since I last checked.
When did you look?
Quite a while ago.
Oh,
That's 37 was the number that was sticking in my head.
I've got a spreadsheet of all the states and their population.
Oh, that is ultimate.
I think we've got 41, and the 9 we don't have, like 9 are the lowest population.
Soon enough, we'll be able to do a 50-state US tour.
50 countries is mad. That's like a quarter of the world.
I know. It baffles my mind every single time I hear someone's been listening to my voice in a country that doesn't speak English as the first language.
South Korea, Iran, Serbia, Thailand, Egypt, Iceland, Indonesia, Turkey, Bulgaria, Guernsey, Trinidad, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia. Right, stop.
Blimey, that is impressive.
Oh, man. A man's always the fun.
Shout out Habsy. Slightly, if I was to put a bit of a damper on it, could just be one super fan who's also a big fan of travelling the world, listening to our episodes in every country he goes to.
We haven't even started talking, we just took on completely off the podcast.
I know, it's just supposed to be a little introduction, trying to spread the word. You know me, I love my tangents. But one more thing, I'll say any support, comments and feedback are much appreciated, and you can get in touch via our new website linked below. So finally, on with the episode. I'm your host, Sir Calum of Wigan, and sitting with me virtually at the Co-Conspirators Podcast Illuminati-shaped Knights table are Sir Luke of Charlton.
Howdy there.
And Sir John of Chelsea.
Good morrow.
Both royal boroughs, so very fitting for our lordship.
And I'm the black sheep at the table, just lowly Lancashire.
You say that, but I've seen on TikTok today that Wigan is the most booming property market in the country. So
that is very surprising. Personally, who's doing TikToks about property?
Properties in Wigan as well.
So the North Koreans at it again, hijacking the Chinese algorithm.
Talking of North Korea, did you see the news today? Essentially, Kim Jong-un's come on national TV and he said that the country needs to prepare for hardship. And I mean, people on the border in China are basically looking in and they're saying that it's literally 1990s North Korea famine levels all over again. Because the country's closed itself off for coronavirus and they've got no food imports from China, which they rely on. Apparently they're screwed right now.
As if they weren't screwed before under Kim's rule, where he's getting all the food.
Well, when he's having to go on national TV to say it's going to be bad, that's when, it's actually going to be bad, because he usually likes to overplay how good things are.
Who's he warning?
The people.
Surely they know.
I mean, just a message of morale, I guess.
A morale, and also you may die.
Yeah. Not my fault.
So now, after yet another tangent, I think this might be a record, even by the Co-Conspirator standards, for the number of tangents within the first intro of the podcast. So I was referencing to our chivalric titles of Sir Knights of the various realms of our football teams that we support. It shouldn't be too difficult to guess that we're once again turning back the page of the history books as we visit the beginnings of medieval Europe. Known as the Dark Ages, This is a period where the revolutionary advancements of previous civilizations like ancient Rome and ancient Greece came to a grinding halt following the fall of the Roman Empire. If you've listened to our previous episodes, we've referenced the Dark Ages several times, building up a sort of anti-hype train with suggestions that this could be one of the least eventful installments of the Co-Conspirators podcast, because, as historians would lead you to believe, nothing happened. Or, maybe to be a bit more fair, very little was written down or very few records could be found. So naturally, later medieval historians would term it as such. So it's perhaps spoilt by the intellectual smorgasbord offered by the Roman Empire. The comparative scarcity of historical records in the years that followed its demise is where the name was derived. Coined by 14th century Italian scholar Francesco Petrarca, the term was meant to act as a contradiction to the light of classical antiquity, as he was dismayed at the lack of records that reference the early Middle Ages, especially as we've mentioned that the Romans were pretty good at notating their own successes, obviously being very biased as well, but a lot of stuff was written down. So this period is believed to have lasted from the late 5th century all the way through to the early 10th century, before we entered the Middle Ages, and historians remembered where they left their quills and parchments. It was thought to be a time of warfare and so-called death of European culture, as various barbarian hordes swept through the continent, competing for control of Europe. In more recent times, describing this period as a quote-unquote Dark Age has drawn strong criticism from some historians, determined to establish that there was actually something that went on, some goings-on, some inventions to be found. They accused medieval scholars like Petrarca of viewing history through Roman-tinted glasses. While we've joked this could be a rather boring episode, could this be the perfect blank canvas for mystery and conspiracy to run wild? In what might seem like a massive contradiction to my introduction, painting the Dark Ages as a period of literary wasteland, I would like to discuss one of the true classics of medieval writing. A tale that has inspired so many elements of storytelling, while also being the source for countless adaptations, from stage plays to heavy metal songs, and everything in between. There's only one character who commands such respect and reverence. Any guesses?
Mickey Mouse.
In the medieval times, unless he's a time traveller.
I mean, I've got a good guess, but I think I know who it is, but I'll let John have a good guess.
I don't know.
It's Camelot's mate, isn't it?
Right indeed. The man himself, King Arthur, or should I say the legend of King Arthur. I'm going to be exploring the possibility that this seminal work of fiction may actually be rooted in fact.
When was this written, or supposedly written?
Well, I will come on to that. There's been very many adaptations through the years, but there is quite a few historical, I'll say, documents that allude to the presence of a man that could potentially be the legendary once and future king. Our regular listeners may know, especially if you listen to our podcast on ancient Greece, that I was in fact raised on the Iliad and the Odyssey in their picture book forms. So naturally that has inspired my appreciation for fantasy writing, something that likely would not exist without the backbone of Arthurian legend. So naturally, this theory is close to my heart. So now I've all but exposed myself as a massive nerd, let us venture forth to Camelot, the realm of Arthur Pendragon. I'm assuming you both know the story, or the major elements of it.
Yeah, I've seen the cartoon.
Yeah, so it starts with a young squire searching for a sword for his brother, pulls a mysterious blade out of a stone and realises that he's accomplished a feat that no other knight in the realm has been able to do, crowning him as the one true king of England. And during his reign, he'd faced many trials and tribulations, establishing the chivalric code with his Knights of the Round Table, all whilst trying to deal with warring factions, the Orkney clans, trying to take over his reign from inside and outside of his castle walls, especially since his Queen Guinevere was having an affair with his best mate, Lancelot.
I was just going to say, I absolutely love the idea that it's just this sword and a stone, and if you pull it out, you become king. Like, I can imagine if that was a thing now, you'd just go there and everyone would be like scrapping, trying to have a go at trying to pull this sword out. And then people with like their bloody JCB diggers trying to get out.
It wouldn't have quite the same sort of divine effect as it would now. We've got so much more firepower at our hands before then. I assume that when it was first introduced as a very dignified affair, everyone's waiting to take their turns, have a go. Oh, no, can't do it. And then Arthur actually comes across it just pure by chance. No one's in the abbey at the time. He just pulls it out, doesn't think anything of it, and turns out he's king of England, so lucky guy. But the tale would end in tragedy, with Arthur killed at the hands of his traitorous and illegitimate son Mordred, he himself a knight of the Round Table, plunging England into darker times. So obviously you'd have to strip away some of the more fantastical elements, clearly added in later revisions of the tale, such as the quest for the Holy Grail and the Lady of the Lake, things like that, Merlin, a time-travelling wizard. I'm not sure those are very set in stone parts of British history, but you never know, since very little is actually written about the Dark Ages that we can find.
I like the pun there as well.
Yes, that was very unintentional, but it's something I say quite a lot when talking about these historical theories. So, as we were saying, there is still an enduring belief, maybe sort of not clutching at straws, but I mean hope rather than expectation, that some of Arthur's adventures may have been inspired by real events, even going as far to assert that the legendary king actually lived in medieval Britain. So how much truth is there to such a revelation? So as Luke touched on, asking about the age of the text I'm about to discuss, this is where we go into it now, and there's been a few historic texts that have somehow survived from the dearth that was left in the Dark Ages, giving its name. So that's if they even happened at all, as Luke may come on to discuss later in the podcast. But like many historical tales, the legend of King Arthur cannot be traced back to one definitive source, rather a progressive retelling of a story or myth over many years, with different authors adding their own embellishments. Did the exploits of a 5th century freedom fighter leading British warriors against Saxon invaders really lay the groundwork for one of the most widely renowned literary classics? The first reference to a possible real-life figure fitting the title of King Arthur came in a 9th century text entitled The History of the Britons, which was thought to be written by a Welsh monk called Nennius.
I love how that in this time there's people called Arthur and people called Nennius, and some names have survived, and I don't think there's anyone called Nennius anymore.
Yeah, I was like, calling your kid Nennius is not going to have a good time through school. I suppose, yeah, just you maybe consider yourself lucky your name survived through that long, but I don't think there's many people called Calum or Luke around that time. Actually, no, because Luke was in the Gospel. So
Yeah,
maybe...
Luke was.
Yeah,
Luke
Luke's
and
2,000
John were.
years,
I don't know
mate.
about Calum.
Yeah.
To be fair, when you said that, I was like agreeing with it, and then actually, yeah, I'm in the Bible, so.
So yeah, in this work by Nennius, Arthur is portrayed as a valiant warrior who led the Britons to 12 victories against Saxon invaders. So following on from this was a 10th century book called the Welsh Annals, which seems to be based upon the history of the Britons, crediting Arthur with a great victory at a place called Badon, or Baden, I'm not sure how you pronounce it. Now, this Battle of Baden was fought during the late 5th or early 6th century between defending Celtic Britons and Anglo-Saxon invaders. Several sources have described this battle, but without reference to the so-called King Arthur, but it is widely accepted by scholars this was a matter of historical record and did actually take place. So following on from these two documents, where things take a bit more of a fantastical turn, is the introduction of Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain, which was written in the 1130s, and the first script to plot Arthur's life from his birth at Tintagel to finding resting place in the legendary Isle of Avalon. Geoffrey also included key elements that would later be established as part of the legendarium, such as Merlin, Guinevere, and Excalibur, the legendary sword. In the 1150s, the French got their hands on the tale, with Norman poet translating Geoffrey's work into French and adding the Knights of the Round Table. Further French Romanticism by 12th century poet Chrétien de Troyes expanded the legend, describing the quest for the Holy Grail and adding the character of Lancelot du Lac, or Lancelot of the Lake. While very little in the way of historical evidence seems to be recorded from Western Europe during the Dark Ages, it's safe to say that we can disregard these later reworkings of the story if we want to focus on the more factual accounts. So as I said, that basically leaves us with two documents, being the history of the Britons and the one based upon that, which is the Welsh Annals. So in the history of the Britons, there is, as I said, direct reference to a man called Arthur who, quote, fought with the kings of the Britons against them, the Saxons, but he himself was the commander of battles, basically establishing him as a mighty warrior who led his people against the invading forces. Arthur is credited with 12 battles, the final being the aforementioned Battle of Baden. Arthur's prowess on the battlefield was unparalleled, according to these retellings, writing that there fell in one day 960 men from one charge of Arthur, and no one slew them except him alone, and in all battles he was a victor. So basically Arthur's got a very, very long kill streak in that battle.
It's not implausible.
I suppose he could have just been that good.
He could have met with the Byzantines. He's just sat there with a flamethrower while they were charging at him with a sword. Wait, that's a spoiler alert, actually, isn't it?
Is it a spoiler? That's technically speaking, yes, Louise. So it's a premonition, that's what we'll call it. Yeah, hold that thought on Byzantine flamethrowers. But yeah, this Battle of Baden is a bit of an area of contention when crossing the legend of King Arthur with the reality of British history. Because, as we mentioned earlier, the Battle of Baden was very likely did take place in the 5th and 6th century. But the first known recounts of a king of an Arthur of the warrior Arthur was in the 9th century, so that leaves a gap of around 300 years. Again, a little bit more premonition there for Luke's theory later on.
Ooh, it's all adding up now.
Yeah, like I said, there's no doubt the way that history gets retold, things get lost over the years. That 300 years is a long time for a story to remain in existence, remain in circulation, and it could have easily been lost to the ages, never to be rediscovered again. Especially when other accounts from around the same time of the battle made no mention of Arthur or his deeds on the battlefield, despite thinking one man slaying 960 invaders would have been front page news at the time, be something you'd want to be
Front parchment news.
be shouted from the rooftops. But on that, though, and there's an alternative hypothesis that suggests the monk Gildas, who was responsible for detailing the battle in his 6th century work on the ruin and conquest of Britain, originally detailed Arthur's accomplishments in the battle. However, again, this is where legend and history crossover. Gildas chose to erase all record of Arthur in his works after Arthur killed Gildas's brother, Hwael mab Cor. And in Welsh folklore, Hwael was a long-standing rival of King Arthur's, potentially strengthening this historical claim. So again, it's quite difficult. It sort of blurs the line between history and legend. It's very difficult to establish this hard evidence, but it's definitely an interesting thought. And alternatively, again, modern writers have suggested that the details of the battle and Arthur's reputation were so well known that it basically went without saying. Gildas didn't even have to include Arthur's name in the works. Just know Arthur was there doing what he did. But I think further doubt is cast upon the credibility of the history of Britons, as there is a suggestion that the names of the battles described in this book were taken from a poem written in Old Welsh. Some of the battle names even rhymed. For example, Dubglas and Bassas, Celadon and Gwynon. I mean, it's not beyond the realms of possibilities the war could feature battle locations that could be strung together in rhyming couplets.
Yeah, why not?
But I mean, in this case, it does seem rather convenient to be, say, I was trying to think of a few rhyming couplets of places in Britain. All I could come up with was Cornwall to Dingwall or Inverness and Skegness, which are pretty far away. So if you're going in consecutive battles where the Saxons are fighting on all fronts, got you right down in the south, and surprise attack in the north, you've got to travel 600 miles across the country to defend.
Surely there's loads of names that rhyme.
I didn't want to Google it.
Anything that ends in B or Ford, Daventry and Utree.
Yeah, I suppose. That's a good point.
Although
Again,
Utree's not a place, it's an operation, isn't it? That was heavily focused on Daventry. I'm chatting absolute grease right now.
But yeah, I suppose. I mean, it's a loose connection there, but it does sort of cast a bit more doubt. The fact that you've got these nicely lining up battles that are in twos and they all rhyme. So again, it doesn't really reinforce Arthur's claim as a true figure of British history. And then maybe perhaps the final nail in the coffin to this argument is it's been argued that the author of the history of Britain, supposedly the monk called Nennius, didn't even regard himself as a historian. Instead, he described his works as sermons, aimed at describing a particular vision of the relationship between God, his British people, and their quote-unquote foreign enemies, aka the Saxons. While many key figures were referenced during this retelling of British history, they often fell out of the widely accepted chronology, as the author attempted to paint a noble story of British Christianity. So playing fast and loose with the truth seems to have been a common theme in historical retellings, and many empires and civilizations were maybe guilty of this, trying to paint themselves in the best lights we've discussed several times over this podcast. Romans in particular being particularly guilty of this, say, crime. But you think in times of war, where propaganda was essential to maintaining the morale of the fighting folk, it's quite understandable when you consider the historic context of these early texts. So Britons were trying to defend their lands against invading Saxon forces. So tales of a fearsome warrior with divine protection could have inspired courage amongst the ranks. We may never know how true the origins of King Arthur were, but it's safe to say that the legendarium it inspired is a testament to the storytelling of early Britons, as the legendary tale has endured for more than a millennium. Was King Arthur a historical hero or strictly a fictional freedom fighter?
I think it's a difficult question, and whatever the answer is, I'm sure if it was a real king or if it was born out of fiction back in like a 1,000 years ago, whoever it was would be proud that their story or persona was put into film and starred none other than David Beckham. So they've done themselves proud there. But yeah, it's really interesting. I think King Arthur is one of my favourite kind of stories or non-fiction books, or what you believe.
Documentary.
Yeah. So to hear there's some belief that King Arthur was actually a real figure, I mean, I find that incredible, and for that reason I'm going to score it a 9 out of 10. In terms of believability, I don't think it's beyond the realms of possibility. I think it's probably a bit far-fetched that he was the King of England as the modern story would suggest. But then again, you've got these French romanticists, all these people kind of making up extra parts of the story as they go along. Potentially, it could have just been like a leader of the local war team or whatever. And
guerrilla fighters.
Yeah, he was just leader of like a local tribe maybe. And he was also a big fan of poetry, so he'd only fight in battles that rhyme.
He chose his battles well.
Yeah. But yeah, I definitely don't think it's past the realms of possibility that he existed, just not on the scale that we're made to believe today. I mean, a story's got to start somewhere, and maybe it was Arthur's just a king, and then the rest of it all followed. So I'm going to score it at 3.5 out of 10. That this story is based on a real person. I do think it's most likely a fictional story. No doubts the majority of the story we know today is fictional, but I think probably based on a fictional character, like you mentioned, it was a propaganda.
Yeah, that's fair enough there. I think it's the chances are there was someone called Arthur during those times. They thought, hey, I like that name.
Yeah.
The authors just ran with it from there. Anything to add, John?
Yeah, I mean, I really enjoyed this theory. I think, especially in Britain, I don't know about around the world, but certainly in Britain, King Arthur and Excalibur and all these kind of stories are so well known. I'm not entirely sure why, to be honest, but I think everyone's heard of King Arthur. It's quite a popular one around the campfire.
I just think it's because it's had so many retellings, and all these historians and poets have reworked it and just basically it's just kept the story alive through retellings. Have you seen the new, latest and most updated version of King Arthur? The guys added they've gone to find the quest for the Holy Grail. Absolute madness.
Seen the new update.
Yeah.
It's just one of the go-to kids' books, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Even before then, it would be just told around the fires and stuff. You think just because everyone loves to hear. So it's got all the tropes of a great story: a mighty warrior fighting battles, slaying enemies, saving damsels in distress. It's also a bit more of an idealized time where chivalry and the code of virtues was widely accepted, rather than the barbarous times that seem to have been going on during the Dark Ages.
Yeah, I think it's especially popular. I don't know. We seem to like to romanticize that kind of era. I think everyone quite likes the idea of all the fighting with swords and all this kind of stuff, and kings and like knights of the Round Table. So it's popular, and I really did. Yeah, I enjoyed it for that reason. So I think in terms of theory, I'm going to go for an 8.5 out of 10. In terms of believability, I don't know, because I always kind of fall on the side of there's no smoke without fire. So I think certainly did exist and was probably quite a prominent figure. And I think certainly back then, we're talking hundreds of years ago, it's quite easy for a legend or a powerful warrior for that to kind of be blown out of proportion and passed down the generations.
I think as well, just going off that, like if he was a leader of people and, it's whatever year and you don't know anything about science or whatever, you could just, if he's powerful, he's just like, yeah, the reason I'm in this position is because I just pulled a sword out of a rock, and people would probably believe it, to be honest. So you can see why a legend could be created by the man himself, I guess.
Or maybe just one of these monks happened to be witnessing the battle, saw a guy pinned into a corner. He slayed 4 men. That just down around the campfire retellings went 4, then to 24, then to 124, then with 960.
I mean, you hear people today, like they over-exaggerate their achievements. There's those people that love to brag. And I mean, he's probably just like making it up as he goes along. Yeah, I just slayed 924 people in my last battle,
So, yeah, I think even though there's not any, concrete evidence, I think there's never gonna be for something that long ago. So I'm not really gonna write it off too much for that reason. And like I say, there's a bit of, I don't know, he's such a well-known figure, so popular, so legendary that I'd hate to think that it was completely made up. I think there's got to be some sort of truth to it. So I think I'll go for a bit higher than Luke. I think I'll go believability-wise a 5 out of 10.
Oh, I'll take that very much. That's good. And I think I'm definitely one of those people who might romanticize the bygone eras a little bit, the whole swords and sorcery and stuff like that. Just living to a proper code of morals and being righteous and just in all that you do. So take me back. Although you probably realistically just be a peasant, like hoeing the fields and doing nothing very remarkable with your life whatsoever. All the knights of the realm went off on quests and adventures. But I digress. I will say, as a big fan of classic literature and reading and just the hero's journey, essentially, is what King Arthur could be boiled down to. I think it's just a fascinating tale, and just it's got all the elements. I think it could survive the ages with all these different authors trying to put their own spin on it, adding new characters, new faces, and new adventures. And there's still basically being adaptations of it now, featuring, say, the great David Beckham in an acting role, which is never something you think you'd say 10, 15 years ago. But here we are. And it was really interesting to dig into some of the surviving historic texts there were from these ages and how they may have contradicted each other, and also the insights historians have provided with how they guess that certain things might have been retold to put basically as propaganda or to put a more religious spin on the history of England with some of these monks. And for that reason, I'm going to score it highly, perhaps being a bit biased because I like King Arthur. I'm going to go for a 9 out of 10.
Cool. Oh, wait, I thought that was the believability.
Yeah, that weren't believability. Yeah.
Maybe I'll wait for that. Holy horse, give me 10 for believability.
Go for a 10 out of 10. You actually met him down the pub.
A bloke called Arthur. He was a good boxer. But I suppose with the believability, though, it's one of those things that how much weight do you give to the idea that there could have been a man who was a pretty handy warrior, that someone just looked at, okay, right, King Arthur, there you go. That's what we'll call him, King Arthur. He was, maybe as Luke said, just a leader of a local tribe who had a few key victories, defended his land from Saxon invaders for a bit. Then as things basically snowballed with campfire retellings, and then caught wind of the French romanticists, and the story went from there into the legend that's known today. So
it seems a bit weird that it's gone from what it is to kind of being blown out of proportion, and this King of England was so great by the French of all people. That bit strikes me as odd, but
I think they were Normans rather than actual proper Frenchmen. So when the Normans invaded in 1066, so they spent some time over here, learnt our histories, learnt some of our stories, and I guess they really liked King Arthur. They thought, that's the man we should all try and live like. But yeah, it's just, I don't know where you get a quest for the Holy Grail to link to us. Just going to go from a fighter defending his lands, which may have been realistically true, to going off to other dimensions, essentially, and finding everlasting life with the Holy Grail. That definitely brings the believability down, even though I did basically discount those sources. But they have just become very much part of the legend of King Arthur. So let's just try to bring it back to the main thing. I think personally that maybe it's a little bit biased. There was definitely someone, it must have started from someone. Maybe, I don't know, was Beowulf a real person? I'm not saying that they're linked, but do you think the poem of Beowulf might have also been inspired by someone's heroic deeds? There's always got to be, so not like life imitating. You got to have your inspiration from somewhere, don't you?
Well, you say that, but I mean, I don't really think Tintin and Harry Potter are real people based on
Well,
they're also from the 2000s. Yeah.
You're saying people weren't as creative?
I you said they could have been more creative back then. Do you think they
would have been taken more literally, I think.
Yeah, as we said, it's easy for someone to say, "Oh, I've got divine powers, etc.," because I haven't been killed on the battlefield. You think a lot of people got killed.
I mean, kind of extending from your idea that it's a real person and it's just been blown out of proportion with all these crazy stories. I guess you can kind of add into that St. George was a real person. It's been said that he slayed a dragon. Obviously, that's blown out of proportion. And then you've got St. Nicholas is a real person, and now apparently he's delivering Christmas presents. You've got these stories of...
Do you mean apparently?
You have got these stories of real people in history of being romanticised by the French. Well, not necessarily the French, but...
Yeah, but then again, on the flip side, a scholar or a monk who has thought, right, I've got a brilliant idea for a story. How about I find this king, right? And he pulls a sword out of a stone, and it gives him the rights to rule England. No, having not started, just basically purely out of his imagination. But I think it's probably more likely they saw, there's maybe not a bloke called Arthur, but it's just someone who was out fighting and inspiring the troops and thinking, right, we can start a tale based on this. They never expect it to get as big as it did. It just thought it'd be a romanticised version of British history. And then the Normans got involved, and just we can thank them for where Arthurian legend is in this day and age. But overall believability, I'm going to go with John. I'm going to go for a 5 out of 10. It's a possibility that there was an original sort of muse for this legendary tale. But now I think that's enough of my literary ramblings. I'll hand it over to Luke to maybe discuss were the Dark Ages even a thing in the first place, which could basically invalidate mine own theories for having never existed at all, if it is to be believed.
Well, actually, I'll come on to it, but it doesn't invalidate them. It could just state that it actually happened 300 years before we actually thought they happened. So hold your horses. So I've got a quick question for you two. What year do you think it is right now?
I think, well, the little clock on the bottom of my computer screen tells me it's 2021.
I agree.
Because with simulation theory, that could all be a massive lie.
Well, according to a school of German scientists, that is a total lie. And we're actually in the year 1724. And I'm going to come on to a reason in a minute. I'd just like to start by saying I absolutely love the Dark Ages. One of my favourite authors, Ken Follett, writes lots of historical dramas, and he is very famous for going into very accurate detail. He contacts historians, he does all the research he can, and bases his novels on the factual situations at the time, from anything from what underwear they wore to what food they ate. You know, he's researched that, and he said when he was writing a book on the Dark Ages, he literally was an author for the first time because he actually had the freedom to write what he wanted, because literally he could not find out anywhere from anything what actually happened in the Dark Ages. And, you know, this is a kind of similar story that a lot of historians have found. Literally almost 300 years. There's nothing written, nothing happened, hardly any artifacts. Although I will caveat by saying I think this is a very European-centric view.
I was going to say, I'm glad you realised that he didn't find much out about the Dark Ages, or your expertise has been very much formidable in the conspiracy game we've got coming up later on. I'd be definitely looking at a double loss if Luke's influence was to, reign supreme.
Yeah, I think if you go around the continents, you've got North America and South America. South America had their history wiped out by the Spanish. Australia, no one knows about that history. Asia, you've got records of stuff happening in the Dark Ages, but then Europe, nothing. And I think that's the most surprising of all, because, Europe is the powerhouse, has always really been the powerhouse, and nothing to happen in Europe in a time after the Romans, as Calum mentioned. It's a bit crazy, really.
I suppose where most of our historical knowledge comes from, mainly just because that's how it's been taught in schools. We always tracked it through the way we're doing now, going through the history books from Egyptians, Greeks and Romans, and now nothing.
Yeah. And two German scientists, amongst others, come together and developed the phantom time hypothesis. And this basically suggests that 297 years of history were made up or miscalculated, and we actually skipped 297 years. It's very interesting because they did this in the 90s. They're very intelligent guys. They clearly felt like the multitude of records on the Islam Caliphate and I think the Tao Suming dynasty in China as well, they clearly felt that was irrelevant. But it's an interesting theory, and this theory basically says that we're living in the year 1724 right now. So all I'll say is I'll make some predictions for the future in the next 300 years. Watch out for something called coronavirus.
A party like it's 1724.
Yeah. But the main guy who came up with this so-called phantom time hypothesis was, as I mentioned, a German scientist called Illich. I don't know if it's a loosely termed scientist. I haven't done a lot of research into him, but the word scientist, makes you think, smart guy. He's got some useful thoughts, but he is essentially claiming a multitude of things about the Dark Ages. And his first kind of point came up when he was researching the Holy Roman Empire. He claims that Pope Sylvester II, the Holy Roman Emperor Otto III, and the Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII all decided to get together and change the calendar to make it seem as if the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, Otto, had actually begun his reign in the millennial year of 1000 AD rather than 996. The obvious reason for this being that 1000 sounded a lot more meaningful than 996. Especially considering that's 1000 AD, so 1000 after the year of Lord. You can imagine why the Holy Roman Emperor would want to kind of have this attached to him.
Yeah, I suppose that explains 4 of the years, doesn't explain.
I was just about to say that.
Yeah,
explains 4.
So he's got these 4 years, and then he's like, wait, if they made up these 4 years, let me do a bit more further research and see what I can find. So was
this like the the Byzantines' idea of a prank back then? I'm going to quickly change the calendars. The emperor will never know.
I know a lot of people, you hear terms like financially illiterate nowadays when you say, these people are financially illiterate. But can you imagine in the year 996, everyone was just date illiterate, that the fucking emperor could just change the date by 4 years and no one noticed? But I
think there's probably a lot of effort to write things down back then, so you wouldn't be bothering writing down the date at the top of your paper every time.
Well, you do think as well, the world's so separated. I actually have no idea what's going on. Like, is South America, the Incas are almost obviously on a different calendar to the Chinese, they're on a different calendar to the Europeans, and how well integrated is a European calendar in the year 996 anyway, to be honest? So
I suppose it does all boil down to on a daily basis, right? light, I do things, I have energy. When it's dark, I feel sleepy. But maybe try to track in between the longer periods of maybe, it's a bit warmer now, we can call that a period. It's cold now, we'll call it a different one where nothing grows.
It's definitely interesting. And Illig, who was a scientist, he further claimed that the trio altered existing documents and created fraudulent historical events and people in order to back themselves up. So he claims that have you heard of Charlemagne?
I have indeed.
So he actually claims that the Holy Roman Emperor Charlemagne was not, in fact, a real ruler, but simply a King Arthur type legend.
Further supported by the fact that Christopher Lee has a heavy metal album entitled Charlemagne. So it could be Christopher Lee all along.
There you go. He's in on all this. But it also goes on to explain that through all of this kind of tampering and forgery, they added an extra 297 years to history. They got a bit too trigger happy, and instead of skipping 4 years, they managed to do 297, which I'm not sure how they managed to do, but there's a bit more kind of technical detail on that in a second, really, because it comes about, I think, 500 years later when it gets a bit messy, because going back to supposedly these forged documents, people are looking at these forged documents being like, that happened then, and then all the calculations become a mess. But essentially, there's also a really inadequate system of dating medieval artifacts right now, as well as an over-reliance on written history. And these are part of the reasons why these 297 years were added. So the years in question, the years 614 to 911, we know the years prior to 614 were full of historically significant events. There's lots documented that. As were the years after 911, the Vikings came about not long after that. But he claims that the ones in between were unusually dull, as we've mentioned before.
I mean, to drag other conspiracy theories into it, just hit year 911 gets my conspiracy brain tingling.
I was going to say,
As I said,
the OG 911 thing.
Yeah, I mean, if ever there was evidence there was an Illuminati, it's probably these three blokes that started it off.
I don't know what happened in the year 912 for this German scientist to decide the year when it all of a sudden got real again. There must have been a major event that happened that year. I have no idea. But, so going into the technical side of it, there's some big mathematical discrepancies between the Julian and the Gregorian calendars, and this further complicates things. So we essentially switched to the Gregorian calendar because the Julian calendar said the full year is 365.25 days long, and the Gregorian calendar, which is the one we use now, says it's actually 11 minutes shorter than that. So this meant that switching between the two calendars should create a discrepancy of 13 days. However, there was only a discrepancy of 10 days found, meaning that there were 3 missing days. And given 1 year was 11 minutes shorter, for there to be 3 missing days basically meant there were 300 years missing. So 300 years had somehow gone wrong in their calculations when they were switching between the Julian and Gregorian calendar.
And they noticed that and just thought, fuck it, leave it.
To be fair, judging by my attitude at work, you're like, that's close enough, isn't it?
I'll only erase 4 years with several pints of mead later. Oops, there goes 300. Just leave it.
In a maths exam and you're 300 years out, just leave it like that.
Well, if it works for these guys.
I mean, this was like the Roman Catholic Church, the Pope, doing these calculations. So, maybe they weren't the best mathematicians, but in these calculations themselves, 300 years were missing. So it's raised a lot of eyebrows for these German scientists. And then going on to that, Roman architecture that was found in the 10th century in Western Europe is supposedly too modern for the time period in which it was supposedly built. So it's in too good condition. And apparently if you date it properly, there's no way it's actually from like 0 AD. It should be from like 300 years earlier, suggesting again that 300 years was skipped. And through this kind of far-fetched hypothesis, he actually managed to find some more intellectual supporters, surprisingly enough. So Dr. Hans Ulrich Niemitz published a paper in 1995, which was called "Did the Early Middle Ages Really Exist?" And his conclusion, after all his research, was they did not.
Have you got any of this research to back it up? Any little tidbits?
I mean, I don't think you can call it research. I think you can probably call it clutching at straws. But some of the things he says is that between antiquity and the Renaissance, which is in 1500, historians count 300 years too many in their chronology. And he just goes on to say Augustus actually lived 1,700 years ago, not 2,000 years ago. But this guy is also very diehard, the Egyptians being 2,000 years earlier than what we thought, which kind of ties into a theory we talked about before, where the Sphinx is thousands of years older than we previously believed. So he's one of these guys who kind of believes all the dates are a bit messed up, which wouldn't surprise me in some respects, because I can imagine mathematicians in 0 AD getting calculations wrong, calendars becoming all messed up. Switching between all these calendars can probably get a little bit confusing.
I mean, plus they probably wouldn't have, a concept of years maybe back then, or what constitutes the year, and the way they even recorded dates would be maybe completely alien to what we consider now. So it's understandable to a degree. But doesn't his argument that the Egyptians were 2,000 years earlier disagree with his idea that there was only 300 years or whatever missing from between the antiquity and the Renaissance?
Well, weren't the Egyptians before antiquity?
But if you push them further back, doesn't that create even more of a gap that has to be filled in?
I mean, yeah, but he doesn't really have any answers for that. But you raise a good point. There's so many flaws to this hypothesis. I mean, the guy admits himself in his research that a solid counter-argument would be that there's very well-documented experiences of the Byzantium and Islamic regions being at war during the period. So,
okay, facts and logic.
Yeah, I mean, basically, I think potentially an April Fool's paper, but you never know. But it does seem that historians are plagued by kind of a plethora of falsified documents from the Middle Ages. And there was a huge actual archaeological conference on this in Munich in Germany in 1986. So loads of scientists, archaeologists, etc., got together to discuss in a whole day's conference the idea that Middle Age archaeology was kind of falsified.
I'm in the wrong profession. If you can get the funding to go just talk absolute nonsense for a whole day on university tenure.
Yeah. And essentially a guy there called Horst Fuhrmann presented lots of evidence describing how some documents were forged by the Roman Catholic Church during the Middle Ages, and these were actually created 100 years before their great moments arrived, after which they were then embraced by medieval society. So this implies that whoever produced the forgeries must have very skillfully anticipated the future, or there was some discrepancy in calculating dates. So basically, to kind of conclude, this hypothesis is saying we skipped 297 years. They're not sure why. They're saying there's a multitude of reasons, but I essentially think their main reason is suggesting that there was forgery, which caused so much discrepancy in calculating dates that when they have gone to switch calendars, they've basically messed it up so bad that they've skipped 297 years. So I think it's basically saying that if they'd have properly done their calculations, would be in 1724 in the Gregorian calendar and not 2021. So I don't think it's that deep. But based on the calendar we're on now, they firmly believe that the years 600 and 74 to 911 just didn't exist. So yeah, what do you think? Do you think that's a possibility? I think there's some plausibility there. I think 297 or whatever is a bit too much. You can see the odd year getting skipped out. But yeah, what do you two think?
I mean, from this conference, it's hard to argue because it comes straight from the horse's mouth. Nobody...
It's gone over my head.
I think so. The guy was called Horse, who presented this theory.
Horst.
Oh, that's a class pun then.
Right, so I've salvaged that one. But I suppose, in the grand scheme of things, just looking at it purely from a linear perspective, even if we're, say, 274 years out, it's going to have absolutely no bearing on our life other than we'll have to change some dates in every single record.
It's hard enough changing from 2020 to 2021 when you need to ride down, let alone going back to 1724.
Yeah.
I suppose it would invalidate a lot of clauses and agreements and many documents.
And it would just mess up everything as well. You'd be like, yeah, what happened in the year like 1776? And you're like, yeah, the American independence, and then also, oh yeah, the AI revolution took place.
Exactly, because you move backwards, you have to rewrite everything. If we were moving forwards, it wouldn't be as big an issue. You just create another.
Throwing that all to one side, just the ramifications of it, it could actually be interpreted as a good thing. You think we're even more advanced, we've done more in less time.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah,
if you think about it that way.
As in, we're not actually 2,000 years after the Romans. We're 1,700 or whatever.
See, it's a good thing because it will impress aliens.
Essentially,
because we're actually 300.
It's like we didn't actually take 4 million years to invent the internet. We only took 4 million minus 300.
Yeah, exactly.
After all, everything we do is to impress the aliens watching us. Funny, speaking of that, I saw an interesting theory about alien life, thinking that we're basically a zoo to them. They're always there watching. We just don't know it.
Quite like the idea of that, but you know,
Was that on Reddit?
It was
by
on
any
Reddit. It
chance?
was an Ask Reddit thread, I think.
Yes, I read the same
Pretty-
thread. It was
There
quite
was
good,
some
actually.
several interesting answers
Pretty
in
big
there.
cage, at least.
Yeah.
Yeah. But just to turn it back to the theory, I guess it is a really interesting argument. You can say if you look at it purely through a Western perspective, where that's where the Dark Age is traditionally said to have been, when nothing really happened. But you think there's evidence from Byzantine, Ottoman, Muslim eras who seem to have done quite a lot in that time, as we'll have and we'll touch on later in the podcast. So it's quite hard to reason with if it was just some, I don't know, a device to make Charlemagne's reign seem more divine and powerful by starting on 1000. It's got a little bit out of hand and they realised, oh, rewriting history is fun. Whoops, there goes 300 years.
Can you just imagine, though, as well, the repercussions of that? And you're thinking, oh, yeah, whatever. I can't think of any good examples, but you're thinking, like, Confucius is alive at the same time as, like, the Vikings, but it turns out that he died, like, 300 years. Or, I don't know what I'm talking about, but...
It's like passing in the night. All these people could have been existing at the same time if the theory was real, but they might never have met. They never would have met regardless of the time period. Sort of thing. They've been existing their own empires.
Historical Avengers. Everyone was just around.
I think
Yeah.
we talked about him before. Who was alive at the same time? It was, like, Julius Caesar. No, I can't remember who it was. It was Buddha and two other, like, interesting people.
Yeah, that reminds. Yeah, oh, it's going to
It was
bug me
Buddha,
now.
Confucius, and some Greek guy. Plato, maybe?
Yeah, it was yeah.
Is that right?
We're talking about in the concept of maths, I think, or something like that.
Pythagoras. Yeah, Pythagoras and Buddha.
There you go. God, bloody good memories
Turns
then.
out-
Was like Picasso only died in the 80s. I always think of him as well old.
Yeah, it's kind of strange to think that, because you look at his paintings, they're definitely years ahead of their time, because he was rubbish if you looked at it from pretty a skill point. They do way better stuff in the medieval times. But to turn about the theory, as we've basically covered, it's a very, very interesting thought. I respect the guy, I say, crazy enough to come up with it, dedicated enough to say, well, I don't really have many facts or any evidence to support this, but you got to believe me, guys. Come to my conference. We'll talk about it there. So I'm going to give it a solid 9
It's
out of
also
10.
not past German scientists to be very persuasive, as we found out.
Yeah, there you go. And maybe you could argue, to be slightly cynical, they would be up for a bit of history rewriting.
definitely.
Imagine the power you could wield, though. You'd never be able to get away with it now, but you think just to dictate, like say Nero did back in Roman times, other empires, just tailor history to paint you in the best light possible. So I don't like that a bit. I want to scrub that away from history. Just burn the manuscript, then no one will ever find it again. Can't get away with that now with everything being saved on the internet. But believability-wise, I think it might fall down a little bit for this theory, unfortunately. Just because you said yourself that there is evidence of several other civilizations that have documented evidence of existing along the years in the calendar that we currently accept.
I think the argument there is then that, again, the dates don't align. We might say that there's evidence that China was doing stuff in 600 to 900, but does that actually mean they're doing stuff in 900 to 1200? I don't know. Like when we say China has evidence of doing stuff 1400 years ago, maybe we actually mean that was in 300 rather than 600.
Yeah, it does cast some aspersions on basically any recorded time. Anyway, how right could they have been? I mean, even now, how can we fully 100% know that we are on at the time of recording the 9th of April 2021?
Well, totally, we're not, are we? Because, the year's actually like, what, quarter of a day longer than it should be. So.
Oh, yeah. I suppose you've got leap years and things like that and everything. I mean, daylight savings as well mess you up. So, I mean, as we said, he just didn't really have much to fully support. He's dug into it a bit, and he's found that these three guys decided to prank Charlemagne, or try either prank him or to say, right, well, make your empire look pretty cool by living in 1000. And sure, I mean, I can understand them erasing 4 years when nothing maybe happened, but 300 to basically scrub all evidence of that for the entire, I want to say effectively the entire Western civilization of Europe and for nothing really to exist from then is less believable. So I'm going to go. It's a nice idea, but I'm going to go for a 3 out of 10 overall.
Okay. What about you, John?
Yeah, I think it's a great theory. I mean, just the idea of 300 years of history never existing is pretty crazy. So yeah, I'm going to go for 9 out of 10 on overall theory as well. I think in terms of believability, I don't know. I do think it is plausible. I certainly think that the whole moving the calendar forward 4 years or whatever, I could, especially around Roman times, I could certainly see that happening. And I don't know if this is me just, I don't know, thinking too little of the olden times, but I just part of me doesn't really trust like their timekeeping Once a few
I don't
hundred
think
years
you're
ago.
alone
You've
there.
also got all these arguments where, like,
Yeah.
Jesus wasn't born on Christmas Day in 0 AD or whatever. He was born, like, I don't know, but there's all those kind of conspiracy. Yeah,
Summer, I think. It's
there's lots of
born in
conspiracies
September.
about Jesus' actual birthday as well, which again just messes around with these dates.
But also the fact that Jesus may or may not have actually existed,
Yeah.
being the Son of God, which is impossible to prove. So
I could turn water into wine. I used just the
God, have you?
inventor of Robinson's squash. That was one.
life and soul of every party. That was the case.
It's like everyone used to do it in Nando's. You order a water and you end up with a Fanta orange.
It's my religion. I have to do this.
See, I don't know. I do feel like even if it was just a few little mistakes happening over hundreds of years, I don't know. Maybe 300 years is an exaggeration, but I do feel like it's very unlikely we've perfectly kept time from whenever we started recording it to now. So yeah, and I don't know. I think it's plausible. I also do think it's plausible that back then we did have 300 years where nothing happened, because I don't know. In the grand scheme of things, 300 years isn't a massive amount of time. And in terms of documenting big things that happen, again, it could quite easily get lost. So I'm kind of on the fence. I think it's certainly plausible. I think that it could have been the case that we are 300 years further back. But the evidence wasn't overwhelming in terms of solid evidence. So I think I'll go for a 3.5 out of 10 on believability.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this one. Again, I'm a big fan of history, so completely wiping 300 years out of history and saying that, I existed 300 years closer to people like Cleopatra and Julius Caesar and Pythagoras, etc. That's quite interesting to me. So in terms of theory, I'm going to score it 8.5 out of 10. Super interesting. In terms of believability, I think I echo a lot of what John says, right? I do think it's very plausible. You've got places in Scandinavia where in the winter it's sunlight for 2 hours a day, in some places sunlight for 0 hours a day, and if you're living there, you're like, how the hell are you keeping track of any time? Because you can't even use the sun to see when it's like noon and sunrise, sunset, whatever. I've literally looking around me now, I've got a computer screen in front of me, tells me the date. I've got a digital clock, tells me the date. I've got my phone, tells me the date. And I've also got a calendar on my desk that tells me the date. And yeah, half the time I still never know what the day is. So it would not surprise me at all if these people did the same. And, we can say that people in those times had the same IQ as us, but they didn't have the same education as us. And although there were great mathematicians like Pythagoras, what he considered to be one of the greatest mathematical innovations at the time, Pythagoras' theorem, is such a basic lesson in British secondary schools these days. And, anyone can understand it really, or anyone with half a brain can understand it. So these people have very plausibly messed up their calculations and the dates are all wrong. I think I'm actually going to go for a 6 out of 10 because I quite strongly believe the idea that people would have forged calendars to better suit them, better suit their civilizations. Like we know even today, like Japan changes their history to suit themselves. I mean, Britain does it as well, kind of paints a nice silver painting over its history. So I'm happy with that 6 out of 10. And I understand going off this, we're going to have a game of conspiracy. A game of conspiracy was actually not invented a year ago when we started this podcast, but 301 years ago.
It survived the ages. It's outlived many generations of the Co-Conspirators podcast. We are, in fact, a reincarnation of the very first Sir Luke, Sir John and Sir Calum, who came up with this on one of their quests. A bit of downtime and a rainy evening in Stoke. Just thought, right, we'll cover the game and just maybe throw some shit at the wall and see what sticks.
Lovely.
With regards to 3 theories, 2 are genuine, pertaining to the topic at hand, this time being the Dark Ages. 1 has been made up by the host, myself, and it is my co-host's job to identify the one that's been made up, the conspiracy. So without further ado, let's get into it.
Can I just, before you jump in, I don't know if it's worth mentioning because it's not going to go out on the day, but today is the 1-year anniversary of
Is
the
it?
channel being created.
I'll just have to mention that.
To be
I'll
fair, you can
keep that in now.
Your
That's
anniversary, the first episode, because I guess that came out quite a bit after the channel, to be honest.
But today is, it's the first
happy birthday. Very, very fitting, actually. I say, I don't want to make light of his death, but Fitzphilip dies on the 1-year anniversary of the Co-Conspirators podcast. But if that's proof whether it be a simulation, there's been plenty of evidence so far. I'm starting to believe.
Respect him taking one for the team.
No, no.
To make the Co-Conspirators' birthday a bit more meaningful. So there, that's one for the calendars. So on a rather poignant little pointer from John, we shall now commence with the game of conspiracy. So conspiracy number 1. The Dark Ages were named thus because they were just that, really dark.
They went on ages.
Well, if these 3 guys Luke was mentioning in their prank for Charlemagne had their way, would have gone on even longer.
Wait, you say that again. The Dark Ages was just dark, so there's like some kind of
Just
like
really dark.
comet or volcanic eruption or something.
Yeah, hold that thought.
Yeah,
You're not been sneaking peeks at my scripts.
I mean,
have
I
you?
just assume that's what it is to make the world get dark, but I'll have a little patience to quote take that.
There you go. So, while Luke may be the one that I desire, the second theory for you all is that the Byzantine Empire used flamethrowers to help them conquer Europe and establish themselves the most powerful faction during the Dark Ages. And number 3, the Dark Ages were a social experiment designed by Christian scholars.
Do you want to go into a bit more detail?
From the top, remember we were mentioning volcanoes? So I'm sure you both remember the Icelandic volcano Eyjafjallajökull that erupted in 2010.
Ooh,
That was a
very
practiced
strange.
that several times. Not quite the way I do in the Welsh town on Channel 4
That's
weather.
beautiful.
I just could never do that. That was tough enough for me. I did have to. I will confess, I had it phonetically spelled out. But that volcano, which I'm not going to try and say again, created an ash cloud so large that planes worldwide were grounded. And apparently, it stopped a young Robert Lewandowski from signing for Blackburn. So who knows what could have been at Ewood Park? I'm pretty sure that's not the first time we've mentioned Robert Lewandowski on this podcast. Shows how many tangents we go off onto it. But to go back to history, historians believed a similar volcanic event plunged the world into darkness in the early 5th century, with historical sources describing a fog that covered the sun, causing a drop in temperature and stunting the growth of crops and trees. And historians have also pinpointed the location of the eruption to Iceland, famous for its volcanoes. So maybe history does repeat itself if you choose to believe this mystery.
I mean, if it was similar to Eyjafjallajökull, I mean, we didn't go very dark for long, did it here? But I guess it's more about whether the conspiracy exists rather than if it's true. But then again, Iceland was literally made from the land of Iceland was literally just made from like volcanoes exploding. So there must have been some mad ones down the years.
Is that not a bit of a dichotomy there? Iceland made a volcano.
Well, Iceland's what Greenland's ice.
Well, that is even
That's
more
a conspiracy
confusing.
itself somewhere, surely.
Country conspiracies where we could annoy a few. But yeah, speaking of hot volcanic substances of fire, the Byzantine flamethrower. So known as Greek fire, this weapon was composed of a highly guarded secret mixture, so secret in fact that the specific recipe has been lost from history.
Isn't that ingredient of
Well, you say that. It's a little bit more nuanced than that, historians will have you believe, as fragments of recipes have been unearthed in later historical documentation, with formulas believed to have been learned from records kept by the Alexandrian chemists, who again were a group of people very much ahead of their time. So the Byzantine military was very highly specialised, deploying unique ships that carried the fiery compound into battle, where it was heated and pressurised before being lit and projected across the battlefield using powerful bellows. It's also believed that this Greek fire stayed alight even when in contact with water, making it deadly for naval battles. Then later Byzantines would revolutionise the technology further, making it handheld and resembling a modern flamethrower. There's also evidence to suggest they had grenades as well, also made of this Greek fire. Sticky, so for some, or just a flame grenade. I'm pretty sure that's a thing. And there you go. It was probably quite similar to a Molotov, actually.
I guess an easy one to make.
And the final conspiracy for you is that the Dark Ages were a social experiment designed by Christian scholars. So as it's been well documented, there was not very much information recorded about the Dark Ages, and that fact, ironically, has been well documented, but it's still perplexing given how the Romans and Greeks were pretty handy with their note-taking. So this theory suggests that the reason stems from Christianity, the prevailing religion in Western Europe. Followers had become more hardline, making it difficult to pursue innovation in an age where cries of blasphemy meant a death sentence. Overseas, however, Arab empires were enjoying a renaissance of scientific and mathematical discovery, leading to an age of prosperity and powerful empires. This angered the Christians, who hated the thought that Muslims were at the forefront of a powerful and forward-thinking empire, compared to the backwards view established by Christian scholars. In retaliation, to try and cover up and prevent this work from reaching the masses, they clamped down on historical documentation, basically limiting it and almost nullifying it, hoping that Muslim interventions and contributions to improving civilization would never be discovered, and in part covering up their own creative failures. This would later lead to the Crusades, which were under the guise of taking the Holy Lands, but really to destroy any evidence of Muslim invention, maybe try and nick some of them for themselves. So over to you guys, and what do you think? Is that enlightened you? Is it darkened your minds? Made it feel difficult?
For some reason, I feel like I've heard all of them. So I don't really know what to go for. I mean, I'll start with the first one. I think I've definitely heard it, but then it's like, have I heard it to describe why the dinosaurs have died rather than why the Dark Ages are called the Dark Ages? Because, we hear that a cloud of dust formed over the dinosaurs, all the crops died, they were stunted of oxygen, and they ended up all just suffocating. I think that's one of the explanations. And then in terms of the second one, which I've forgotten what it is now,
flamethrowers.
I've heard of something about flamethrowers in some kind of civilization. So, I think that one's a very cool and creative one to make up, them having flamethrowers, and kind of ties into John's theory on chemical warfare in Persia a couple of episodes ago, or last episode. And then going on to the last one, I mean, there's a lot of detail there, and I know that the Islamic Golden Age was around that kind of era, so that fits in quite well. And you could easily think Christians have, messed around to stop that. So I do think that's out there. So I'm actually going to say the conspiracy is the first one, and you've modified the dinosaurs story.
Okay, John, what about you? Any advances on Luke's thoughts? Do you want to go your own way?
Well, in terms of any sort of logic, Luke seems to break that down quite nicely and have a lot of reasons for his choice. You're not getting that from
Wouldn't
me,
have
I'm
expected
afraid. I'm struggling a little bit. I'm struggling to justify it, but I was actually going to go for the same one as Luke. I think almost because there's the theory that the Dark Ages are called the Dark Ages because it was dark is so obvious that there'd be a theory about that. But I feel like there can't actually be a proper theory about that. So I'm going to give you the opportunity to get the full win and fool both of us. So I'm going to
take that possibility of a full win off your hands, because I've changed my mind. Because it's definitely in my mind somewhere that I've seen that before the Dark Ages might have had a volcanic eruption. I've definitely seen somewhere that at some point in human history there's been a dark period from a volcanic eruption, and I've seem to think Iceland as well. And I don't know if this is just reference to when that Eyjafjallajökull one exploded.
You just really want to say Eyjafjallajökull again, don't you?
Exam for some reason.
Yeah.
I don't know why, but I had some recollection that you did as well.
But I'm going to go for the third one, because flamethrowers, it's sticking out to me. I've seen it somewhere as well. So the third one I'm going to go for.
Well, I say we've had probably a Co-Conspirators first. We've had a mind change at the last minute, right before the bell. Potentially nick a double win from my grasp. And I will now reveal that Luke has had a stroke of genius and that I correctly identified the conspiracy. Unfortunately, John, almost like red herring as the idea of the Dark Age being Dark Age because it was really dark. There is actually some, hard scientific evidence to suggest that there was a massive volcanic eruption, as historians have been able to use X-ray research to discover a layer of volcanic ash preserved in the ice of Iceland, dated to around 536 AD. And using X-rays to determine the chemical composition of recovered ash particles, the researchers discovered that the chemical composition matched that of the volcanic rocks from Iceland. And there is also a Byzantine historical entry that describes a massive fog blocking out the sun and making it difficult to grow things. So that there is a genuine theory, mystery, what you want to call it. I'm still surprised that Luke had the balls to make a last-minute decision change there. Unless he was playing me the whole time, thinking, I get a double win.
Never change your mind, because it never comes in. It's like Deal or No Deal, swapping the last spot.
I don't know where I read it, but I've read it somewhere.
Very surprised.
It was bugging me. And I was thinking that it was a different time period. I was thinking it's the dinosaurs, but, I couldn't stick with it.
That's just a case of history repeating itself. It definitely probably happened for the dinosaurs as well. So just a little bit on the other two. The second one, there's loads out there on Byzantine flamethrower innovations. So the Wikipedia page is absolutely massive, and there's loads of information on possible concoctions that put together using various forms of saltpeter, sulfur, lime even, that makes it able to burn on water, and the various different ways at which they could administer it, and cause them to conquer vast swathes of Europe and retake Constantinople from the Muslim Empire. And also, having read this research, I'm wholly convinced that George R. R. Martin used Greek fire as his inspiration for wildfire during the Battle of Blackwater Bay, for any Game of Thrones fans out there. And then the final one, which was the one I made up, which is maybe loosely based on some facts here that I've thrown together a lot of different influences, like the Crusades and stuff, that suggests that Europe was in a hardline period of Christianity where any sort of scientific innovation was decried as blasphemy. Maybe it might be out there, but in my head, I couldn't find anything to suggest it was such a hardline stance that basically they decided, right, none of these documents are getting preserved, we're going to burn them all and make sure no one finds out how prosperous the Muslim Empire actually was, which it was. There's lots of great scientific and mathematical advancements, like discovering algebra, much to the behest of many a maths student out there. They also apparently discovered they invented windmills. Well, I don't know, I imagine there's quite a lot of people trying to take credit for such a useful invention. And very interestingly, though, the Ottoman Empire would come to destroy one of the largest Muslim libraries, which led to so much research and historical documentation being lost. For example, Arabic translations of many Roman and Greek texts just completely went up in flames, essentially, as Genghis Khan's forces took over.
But then, you still see that today. Sometimes you see kind of rebellious factions in a country going over and knocking over like 2,000-year-old architecture and stuff like that.
Yeah,
like, oh my god!
Try and stamp your authority on the place. I would never want to do that. Just think, it's a bit of a cliche. That is history right there. It could be so important. Just wiped out in the quest for power. But
was ruthless, and that brings us on to our Mongol episode next week.
We could be one. So I think there's out there.
Look into it.
But what we've sort of alluded to in the course of this episode, this is where the history sort of starts to converge. If you look out a little bit beyond Europe, so you've got the Dark Age where nothing supposedly happened, but Byzantines, Muslims, Chinese were all enjoying prosperous periods of their own, which was sort of glossed over a little bit. But I hope this episode on the Dark Ages has left you both feeling suitably enlightened, and our listeners as well. And I shall now draw the episode to a close and say thank you for listening. Check us out on all podcasting platforms, and remember to keep challenging the status quo.